So hello everybody and welcome. We've found the universe and so it's time to get going. I'm Matthew Tews, I'm Executive Director of Arts Programs at Stanford. Delighted to welcome you to this talk by Tracy K. Smith. This is the first event in a year-long series at Stanford called Imagining the Universe. And Imagining the Universe is a collaboration among physicists and artists and theater people and music people and people from the humanities, and even probably some people from engineering, to come together and think about what the universe, how the universe has been represented, how scientists have thought about the universe, how artists have conceived of it, and how we can bring all of that together for a better understanding both of our universe and of how we as humans interact with it. So there is, in addition to this speaker series that Tracy Smith is the first speaker in, there is an exhibition at the Cantor Arts Center of Robert Rauschenberg's Stoned Moon series. There are performances at Bing Concert Hall of the Stanford Symphony Orchestra, Hosts the Planets, as you can imagine, but also a work created by a Stanford alumnus named Nolan Gasser called Cosmic Reflection. That's accompanied with a video that has an entire history of the universe, from the Big Bang to the present, that was created by NASA Goddard, and a staged reading of Bertolt Brecht's Galileo that is organized by the Department of Theater and Performance Studies, among many other things. So check out the entire list of events on the flyer at the front. Check out also the long list of collaborators. I want to especially acknowledge Peter Michelson, the chair of the Department of Physics, who really brought this to everyone, and Jennifer Brody, the chair of the Department of, we can applaud for them at SAC, of Theater and Performance Studies, who's also been very involved in this. So now, thank you to Peter and Jennifer and everyone else who's helped make this happen. Great. So now for tonight's speaker. Tracy K. Smith was born in Massachusetts, earned her BA from Harvard and an MFA in creative writing from Columbia. From 1997 to 1999, she held a Stegner Fellowship here at Stanford, so welcome back. Glad to have you back. She's the author of 3 books of poetry: The Body's Question, 2003, which won the Kawe Kanem Prize for the best first book by an African-American poet; Duende from 2007, winner of the James Laughlin Award and the Essence Literary Award; and Life on Mars, 2011, which won the 2012 Pulitzer Prize for Poetry. In 2014, she was awarded the Academy of American Poets Fellowship. She teaches creative writing at Princeton, and also, I found out, just moved to Princeton, is that right? Was in Brooklyn and now is in Princeton. So she's going to talk to us about life on Mars, about her interactions with the universe, and about her poetry. So without further ado, welcome Tracy K. Smith. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's a delight to be here. My whole family is in the audience. So I don't know if that makes me more or less nervous. I love the vastness of the topic, imagining the universe. But I have to admit that my mind wants to dwell for a moment upon the word imagining, which is what I find myself doing in my poems, no matter whether the topic is based in fact, based in real experience, or based in something like a wish. Imagining, for me, is an act that allows for a different kind of engagement with things. Something that's slower and more reflective and maybe even more meddlesome than the rapid forward movement of real time generally affords. Imagining in a poem invites me to detach from the point of view and the kinds of logic, order, fact, and allegiance that governs my real life. And I suppose it involves a heavy reliance upon the work of individual images, a belief in the real things populating our poems. Those real things, whether they are the actual features of the world I, as a writer, am seeking to create or recreate, or metaphors for the abstract but no less real feelings and ideas that a poem examines are crucial to cementing a kind of faith in the poem and to producing the feeling not just of words on a page, but of a real encounter, a brush with someone or some place. If the images in poems put you in a place and bring you into contact with something you must wrestle with, respond to, watch as it watches back, taking you in, then the metaphors that run through poems do something different but equally fundamental. They tell you, this thing I am trying to make you understand is so unlike its ordinary self that, unable to understand how it feels, you must depart from your normal sense of the thing itself and leap all the way over to this other context. Metaphor pulls you away from literal sense, saying to know how strange or powerful or arresting or terrible this thing is. You must distort your sense of the way the world works. You must abandon what you thought you knew. I think that recalibrating my sense of the usual is my favorite effect of poems. And after that act of imagining, of taking the world in and hunting out its various strangenesses, I get to return to my real life, my own day-to-day point of view, carrying the residue of that departure, of that recalibration. I tell myself that this act has the power to change a person, to change the eyes through which they or I watch the world. And so I feel like the work that happens in a poem is very real. But when I get to the second half of the title, the universe, the very specific images and correlating ideas, a certain set of those ideas come to mind. I want to talk a little bit about how my collection, Life on Mars, is really wrestling with these different versions of what the universe is. Okay, we'll go forward to the next slide. When I first started writing this book, which was simply a matter of writing the first 2 or 3 individual poems as a way of breaking the silence following my second book, I was thinking about the ways that artists, particularly filmmakers, have crafted visions of the future. I was thinking about the very particular nostalgia that I have for visions of the future that would have been in circulation during the early 70s when I was a kid. It's a view of the future that points backward toward a past we can now embrace as quaint, outdated, illuminating more than anything else the concerns, wishes, and trends or anxieties characterizing the present from which it sprung. This is a still from Stanley Kubrick's beautiful film 2001, A Space Odyssey. In these films, other movies that I was thinking of and drawing from pretty consciously were films like Soylent Green. I don't even know if you can call that a film. You're supposed to write movies. Or Omega Man, Planet of the Apes, or Truffaut's Fahrenheit 451. The future is not so much futuristic as it is an homage and an elegy to a present that the filmmaker was in the process of living. So this has a very, 60s aesthetic sense. This no longer is what the future looks like. That realization alerted me to something fundamental about the genre of science fiction. Sci-fi is a device by which we extrapolate to the distant future merely as a pretext, as a means of asking ourselves something like this. If we continue living in the way that we do right now, where will we be in X number of years? What will human life look like and feel like? What conflicts and grave errors will have finally caught up with us? It's a way of looking not so much out at the universe as in through a keyhole onto life here on Earth, into our houses and our cities, or perhaps most poignantly into our heads and our hearts. In the first poems that I wrote in response to this urge, I wanted to see what a perspective like that imparted by science fiction might lend to some of my ongoing concerns as a writer and as a person. Who are we? What characterizes our view of ourselves? What appetites drive us? And what kind of a future are we setting ourselves up for. I'm going to intersperse these comments with poems from the collection I'm referring to. So I'm going to start by reading just 3 of those initial poems. The first one is called Sci-Fi. And the first line of this really was sort of a funny, slight realization, but there's so many hard corners in all of these old versions of the future, and now the future, our sense of design, modern design is much more curved. And that's where the first line of this poem came from. I'm not going to translate every line in these poems because then you'll come away thinking how banal poetry is. But that's how I got into this perspective. Sci-fi. There will be no edges, but curves. Clean lines pointing only forward. History, with its hard spine and dog-eared corners, will be replaced with nuance, just like the dinosaurs gave way to mounds and mounds of ice. Women will still be women, but the distinction will be empty. Sex, having outlived every threat, will gratify only the mind, which is where it will exist. For kicks, we'll dance for ourselves before mirrors studded with golden bulbs. The oldest among us will recognize that glow, but the word sun will have been reassigned to a standard uranium neutralizing device found in households and nursing homes. And yes, we'll live to be much older thanks to popular consensus. Weightless, unhinged, eons from even our own moon will drift in the haze of space, which will be, once and for all, scrutable and safe. I found myself sort of unwittingly imagining that the universe was an American space at those first few poems, because I was thinking about, some of my anxieties about being an American. Of course, that's preposterous, but I'll read you 2 poems that are really kind of indulging in that. This is called The Universe is a House Party. The universe is expanding. Look, postcards and panties, bottles with lipstick on the rim, orphan socks and napkins dried into knots. Quickly, wordlessly, all of it whisked into file with radio waves from a generation ago, drifting to the edge of what doesn't end, like the air inside a balloon. Is it bright? Will our eyes crimp shut? Is it molten, atomic, a conflagration of suns? It sounds like the kind of party your neighbors forget to invite you to, bass throbbing through walls, and everyone thudding around drunk on the roof. We grind lenses to an impossible strength, point them toward the future, and dream of beings we'll welcome with indefatigable hospitality. How marvelous you've come. We won't flinch at the pinprick mouths, the nubbin limbs. We'll rise, gracile, robust. Mi casa es su casa, never more sincere. Seeing us, they'll know exactly what we mean. Of course, it's ours. If it's anyone's, it's ours. The next poem I'm going to read is called The Museum of Obsolescence, and I read it maybe a year or 2 ago at a conversation with a photographer named Trevor Paglen, who had just literally launched a project that was called the Last Photos, and it was 100 images that he didn't take, but he had kind of curated from throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, trying to zero in on things that he thought characterized our appetites as humans and some of our dark and bright capacities. And he had these images etched onto the side of a gold disc, and that was drilled to the side of a satellite that provides cable TV service, and it was launched into the atmosphere to orbit the Earth at such a distance as to ensure it will remain in Earth's orbit for 50,000 years. And so, the great irony, A, is that you will have cable service for 50,000 years, and B, that, these things are likely to outlive human civilization. So this poem felt of peace with that project. The Museum of Obsolescence. So much we once coveted, so much that would have saved us, but lived instead its own quick span, returning to uselessness with the mute acquiescence of shed skin. It watches us watch it, our faulty eyes, our telltale heat, hearts ticking through our shirts. We're here to titter at the gimcracks, the naive tools, the replicas of replicas stacked like bricks. There's green money and oil in drums, pots of honey pilfered from a tomb, books recounting the wars, maps of fizzled stars. In the south wing, there's a small room where a living man sits on display. Ask, and he'll describe the old beliefs. If you laugh, he'll lower his head to his hands and sigh. When he dies, they'll replace him with a video looping on ad infinitum. Special installations come and go. Love was up for a season, followed by illness, concepts difficult to grasp. The last thing you see after a mirror, someone's idea of a joke, is an image of the old planet taken from space. Outside, vendors hawk t-shirts, 3 for $8. So I took great pleasure in acquainting or reacquainting myself with some of those sci-fi movies that I'd grown up on that presented a particularly dystopic view of the future. And so I began to allow myself to reference or riff upon the shared public or cultural experiences of the genre, drawing from a known set of characters. Charlton Heston makes a cameo appearance in the book, for example, and in a familiar aesthetic, indulging in nostalgia and sometimes even kitsch. And that sense of public nostalgia also opened up a space for my own private nostalgia of that era and my own memory of my childhood. And then it occurred to me that we are not limited to thinking about space merely as a site upon which to project our ideas of a distant future. It's going to sound ridiculous to say that I realized this, but I realized or recalled that space is a real place, that we are in it. This room and this planet is part of space. Our lives are taking place in space. Space is our home. Somehow that idea continues to perplex me. I looked at maybe we could get the next slide. I looked at some of the marvelous images that the Hubble Space Telescope has captured. This one is called Hubble Deep Field, and those are literally like thousands and thousands of galaxies. These are images that always had kind of landed in the part of my mind where art goes to, because they're so painterly, so aesthetically appealing, and so composed or curated seeming. I think that was probably just my mind's way of trying to make sense of something so fundamentally incomprehensible. But I wrestled with myself, asking my mind to please stop pulling these images away from the ideas and the concrete facts that they represent. And so I started to try and imagine what kind of a system this marvelous traffic of galaxies might constitute. To the extent possible, I tried to acquaint myself with some, popular science texts, theories of physics described mostly through clever metaphors for people who aren't scientists, or theories of the universe and our place within it that begin to hint at a particularly elegant convergence of terms between the language of science and the language of art, or the language of science and the language of faith. And so I thought I'd share a poem that embodies some of those various threads. It's called My God, It's Full of Stars, and that title is taken from Arthur C. Clarke's novel, 2001, but it's also the opening line of the sequel to that movie, which is 2010, the year we made contact. It's kind of like a dirty little secret that I feel like I've seen it, but I know others of you have also seen it. It's less majestic, but I think it's also, driven by the same kind of wish. Let's see if I can find it. So basically, this is a poem that's a sequence. It's written in a few different sections, and I was just talking with some students about this kind of poem. For me, it's kind of an opportunity to attempt to improvise. I know that with a musician, you're improvising in real time. You say something with your instrument and it can't be taken away. That's not quite the same thing for a writer. But some of the leaps and shifts are really just kind of intuited as opposed to really worked out. My God, it's full of stars. We like to think of it as parallel to what we know, only bigger. One man against the authorities, or one man against a city of zombies. One man who is not, in fact, a man, sent to understand the caravan of men now chasing him like red ants let loose down the pants of America. Man on the run, man with a ship to catch, a payload to drop, this message going out to all of space. Though maybe it's more like life below the sea, silent, buoyant, bizarrely benign, relics of an outmoded design. Some like to imagine a cosmic mother watching through a spray of stars, mouthing, yes, yes, as we toddle toward the light, biting her lip if we teeter at some ledge. Longing to sweep us to her breast, she hopes for the best, while the father storms through adjacent rooms, ranting with the force of kingdom come, not caring anymore what might snap us in its jaw. Sometimes what I see is a library in a rural community. All the tall shelves in the big open room, and the pencils in a cup at circulation, gnawed on by the entire population. The books have lived here all along, belonging for weeks at a time to one or another in the brief sequence of family names, speaking at night mostly to a face, a pair of eyes, the most remarkable lies. Charlton Heston is waiting to be let in. He asked once, politely, a second time with force from the diaphragm. The third time, he did it like Moses, arms raised high, face an apocryphal white, shirt crisp, suit trim. He stoops a little coming in, then grows tall. He scans the room. He stands until I gesture, then he sits. Birds commence their evening chatter. Someone fires charcoals out below. He'll take a whiskey if I have it, water if I don't. I ask him to start from the beginning, but he goes only halfway back. That was the future once, he says, before the world went upside down. Hero, survivor, God's right-hand man. I know he sees the blank surface of the moon, where I see a language built from brick and bone. He sits straight in his seat, takes a long, slow, high thespian breath, then lets it go. For all I know, I was the last true man on this earth, and may I smoke. The voices outside soften. Planes jet past, heading off or back. Someone cries that she does not want to go to bed. Footsteps overhead. A fountain in the neighbor's yard babbles to itself, and the night air lifts the sound indoors. It was another time, he says, picking up again. We were pioneers. Will you fight to stay alive here, riding the earth toward God knows where? I think of Atlantis, buried under ice, gone one day from sight. The shore from which it rose, now glacial and stark. Our eyes adjust to the dark. I'll just read one more section of this poem. Perhaps the great error is believing we're alone, that the others have come and gone, a momentary blip, when all along space might be chock full of traffic, bursting at the seams with energy we neither feel nor see, flush against us, living, dying, deciding, setting solid feet down on planets everywhere, bowing to the great stars that command, pitching stones at whatever are their moons. They live wondering if they are the only ones, knowing only the wish to know, and the great black distance we flicker in. Maybe the dead know, their eyes widening at last, seeing the high beams of a million galaxies flick on at twilight, hearing the engines flare, the horns not letting up, the frenzy of being. I want it to be one notch below bedlam, like a radio without a dial, wide open so everything floods in at once, and sealed tight so nothing escapes, not even time, which should curl in on itself and loop around like smoke, so that I might be sitting now beside my father as he raises a lit match to the bowl of his pipe for the first time in the winter of 1959. So the poem goes on, but I'll leave it there just for the sake of time. But I do want to come back to the idea of belief. The universe, whether it is from the vantage of the naked eye or that of a device like the Hubble, has always signaled something mysterious, something irresistibly unfathomable to us. We humans have always felt watched back by whatever is out there flickering in the distance. What excites me is what the intellect or imagination fashion, not simply an explanation of what is out there, but also to justify the feeling of awe and attachment that the heavens inspire. I can't let completely go of the idea of the distances of space as a mystery, a blank slate, a site for projection. This is owing in part to my own temperament, but also to the fact that while I was thinking about all of this, my father became ill and passed away. Suddenly, I remembered that he had been a science fiction fan his whole life, and moreover, that he had worked as an engineer on the Hubble Space Telescope for years during my childhood. So miraculously, space, a place as remote and seemingly unconcerned with the day-to-day life of a single human being, seemed to provide me with a private context for exploring my own grief at the loss of my father. It allowed me to both consider the universe as a physical setting and also to theorize or speculate upon what that kind of framework might mean in spiritual or metaphysical terms. I had grown up in a family where religious faith was a part of the fabric, and yet my father was also someone with an insatiable interest in science, in the natural world, the natural order that surrounds us. Whenever the usual debate between creation and evolution would come up during my childhood, I remember he always seemed rather relaxed, suggesting there must be more to the question than meets the eye. Couldn't 7 days in God's realm be the equivalent of millions of years and hours, he'd ask, smiling and leaning into the conversation, which, with luck, might then be permitted to drift toward some bit of popular science or nature magazines. With that single gesture, he'd opened up a whole range of ecstatic possibility in my mind. He'd given me a combat-free zone, a space where contradictions, like a spectacular Big Bang and God's originating let there be light, might coexist, and access to the world of faith that did not require me to relinquish access to my faith in the world. It reminds me a little of Isaac Asimov's wonderful story, The Last Question, in which an artificial intelligence converges with the human mind and spirit in a way that, as he describes it, marks a furthering of each, a harmonious marriage, and which leads, after the universe itself has fizzled down to nothing but that evolving mind or force itself, it leads to an act of creation that resembles the one in the book of Genesis. Please indulge me the next slide. I love that. This is like the Sistine Chapel God. I love that kind of hybridity, the different ways that the mind manages to answer several of our species' key questions at once. After my father died, I needed to think in just such a way because it seemed impossible to me that the afterlife to which I must surrender him should be as finite and as fathomable as the version hinted at in the Old Testament. I wanted to play at concocting a version of God that existed at a scale large enough to contain all that we've seen, all the stars and galaxies we've watched blaze into being or vanish from view, which, as you know, is merely a fraction of what is actually there. So I wanted to take a stab at contriving a version of God that's neither being nor force, or perhaps rather both being and force, and yet also something more, something with resonance for every facet of the human mind and all that eludes it. I'll just read a couple. There are a few poems in this book that are really thinking about God. It was sort of an involuntary reaction, but I'll just read two of them. This one is called The Weather in Space. Is God being or pure force? The wind or what commands it? When our lives slow and we can hold all that we love, it sprawls in our laps like a gangly doll. When the storm kicks up and nothing is ours, we go chasing after all we're certain to lose. So alive, faces radiant with panic. And this is a poem called It and Company. We are a part of it, not guests. Is it us or what contains us? How can it be anything but an idea, something teetering on the spine of the number I? It is elegant, but coy. It avoids the blunt ends of our fingers as we point. We have gone looking for it everywhere, in Bibles and bandwidth, blooming like a wound from the ocean floor. Still, it resists the matter of false versus real. Unconvinced by our zeal, it is unappeasable. It is like some novels, vast and unreadable. So, using the physical universe as a backdrop for my own consideration of death and God and the hereafter served my grief. It also helped cast the ideas of death and belief into things I could imagine living with, things with purpose. I'd like to read one elegy from the book. It's called It's Not. It's not that death was thinking of you or me or our family or the woman our father would abandon when he died. Death was thinking what it owed him, his ride beyond the body, its garments, beyond the taxes that swarm each year, the car and its fuel injection, the fruit trees heavy in his garden. Death led him past the aisles of tools, the freezer lined with meat, the television saying over and over, "Seek and ye shall find." So why do we insist he has vanished, that death ran off with our everything worth having? Why not that he was swimming only through this life, his slow, graceful crawl, shoulders rippling, legs slicing away at the waves, gliding further into what life itself denies? He has only gone so far as we can tell, though when I try, I see the white cloud of his hair in the distance like an eternity. Years ago, I shared some of these poems with the scientists, astronauts, and engineers at the Space Telescope Science Institute. Standing at a podium like this in the middle of the reading, reciting a line like, "Tina says dark matter is a theory, something we know is there but can't completely prove." I felt suddenly and all at once unbearably limited in my understanding of the material. All of a sudden I feared it was silly, or worse than that, irresponsible, to be projecting so many of my own private wishes and beliefs onto something that isn't private or subjective or metaphorical, but public and real. But after the reading, so many of the audience members expressed relief and identification. Technicians responsible for manipulating the images and adjusting the colors to make them readable to the human eye told me that often in their working day, they lose sight of what the data that they're managing represents. They lose sight of how real and how powerful, not only for the world of science, but for the inner life and the human imagination these images are. An astronaut who had done a spacewalk to repair the telescope at one point described exiting the capsule and floating there in space. Can we go to the next slide? He was beside, this mammoth oracle eye of a telescope, and he told me that he actually had to knock against the side of the machine just to convince himself it was real, that he was actually there, wherever there was. I mean, this is somebody whose job it is to get shuttled out into the heart of space and to perform mechanical functions there, to inhabit the place in literal scientific terms, and yet to him it was all too strange, something it seemed his imagination had cooked up as if in a dream. People also spoke of the urgency with which they, in the face of dwindling government spending, had to advocate for the necessity of the research they were doing. They spoke of the commitment to the ongoing work of space exploration that nations across the globe have shown. Seems that many of our U.S. leaders can't get their heads around the idea that space exploration is not the stuff of science fiction, but a new kind of history we are in the process of writing, or, if you will, unearthing here and now. At root, I think my work, no matter what I'm writing about, is about life on Earth. It's driven by very simple questions that might be able to be spun in infinite directions. Questions like, what do we do to one another? What does living feel like? What's the effect of our presence here in our lives? So maybe I'll close by reading one section from the title poem that's really rooted in that awareness that, it's Earth. Can we just get the final slide? The earth beneath us, the earth around and above, the earth pushing up against our houses, complicit with gravity, the earth ageless, watching us rise and curl, our spades, our oxen, the jagged lines we carve into dirt, the earth nicked and sliced into territory, hacked and hollowed, stoppered tight, tripwire, the earth ticking with mines, patient, biding its time, the earth floating in darkness, suspended in spin, the earth gunning it around the sun, the earth we ride in disbelief, the earth we plunder like thieves, the earth caked to mud in the belly of a village with no food, burying us, the earth coming off on our shoes. Thank you so much. So as long as you don't have any hardball science questions, I would be happy to try and answer what questions you might have.
Do you any sort of research about science before writing some of your poems, or how do you, I guess, do you prefer just to take, like, what distance do you get to the subject? Like far away or up close?
I think there was a range. I feel like I always have to say I'm not really writing about this stuff anymore. But when I was, I remember watching a lot of documentaries that created these visual simulations of things, and somehow that visual sensibility helped me imagine a vocabulary that might be able to move around in that zone. And then scientists are so good at coming up with metaphors to try and make their highly complex work graspable. So there's the metaphor of the universe expanding that likens it to raisin bread dough that's left to rise. Everything is moving away from everything else. Or the idea that the universe is infinite and yet also contained like the air inside a balloon. I actually stole that one for a poem. So some of I find that makes perfect sense for just about as long as it takes to read an article, and then it kind of just goes pear-shaped in my mind. But that helped me get a little footing. But then because I'm not trying to do the same work as a scientist, I also felt free enough to imagine things or to draw from fictional texts as well.
I'm curious, you mentioned that you're not writing about this group of topics anymore, and the question just arose in my mind, like, how do you know when you're done with that topic? Is there like a conscious decision or a turning point that you're conscious of, or does it just sort of like fizzle out and like, oh, I think I'm on to something else?
That's a great question. When I'm working on poems, I try to tell myself I'm just writing individual poems, but there's a part of my mind that knows I'm hoping to collect enough to make a book out of them. So there comes a point when I might have, a folder full of poems on my computer, and I'll get the courage to print them all up and see what they start saying to one another. I think one of the effect of writing, over a sustained period is that anything you write is somehow related because it's coming from the set of concerns or obsessions that characterize that time in your life. But then, of course, there's also the artificial device of a project, right? So there was a theme to the poems that I was trying to adhere to some of the time. But once I start trying to see if there is a book in there, I start listening for themes that might indicate rough groupings for the poems, and then I start trying to see if there's a way that I can amplify the conversation that's taking place between one group and another. Sometimes I notice when there are big gaps. So like with this collection, I realized I had this sort of an intuitive sense of why I was thinking about space, but it hadn't been expressly articulated for the reader. So some of the longer poems that I quoted from tonight got written to kind of create a little bit of cement. And then after a certain point, it seems like something's happening, like there's a journey that the book is suggesting, and you can't really resolve things, the kinds of things that most poems are interested in, but you can get to a place where the journey feels like it's kind of done, like you've gotten somewhere. And so when I get there, I feel like the book is over. And, once you come out of something like that, it's really exciting to think about how not to repeat yourself, how to see if, having finished this body of work, you might be able to move even farther from where you started. I've been asked a few times to come back to that theme for different things and write new poems about space, and I just can't. Like that, it was, and that maybe makes me feel a little bit like it was an organic impulse, like it was genuine, and like now maybe the universe is done with me in that regard, and something else is waiting to like grab me. But I think it's just a quiet but perceptible sense that it's time to move to something else.
So this is a follow-up question. For the poems that you're working on now, where do you find that they're going? Where do you find that they're moving? What concerns, if that's not too strong a word, do you see yourself in the middle of?
Well, I've been writing prose for a number of years, so I don't have quite that many poems. The ones I do have seem to be, some are thinking about American history. There was a Civil War project that the Smithsonian sponsored in relation to a photo exhibit, and they asked poets to write poems thinking about the Civil War. It wasn't a topic I would have naturally gravitated toward, but I participated, and so that, kind of set some other things in motion. So there's a little bit of that. I have had 2 more kids since I finished Life on Mars, so parenthood is a theme. And, that last poem that I read, thinking about the Earth, I remember working on the title poem, and everything, it had nothing to do with space. Everything really in that poem is thinking about recent news events and the relationship between individuals and citizens, and it had everything to do with life on Earth. And I got to a moment in the poem where I almost realized that, as if it hadn't been obvious, or I articulated it to myself, and that's where that section came from. But I feel like the Earth, in terms, as a physical place, and, environmental concerns that stem from that are also in my mind. And so I imagine that poems might help me to kind of learn a little bit more about some of the, conflicting viewpoints and possibilities, and then just wrestle with things a little bit.
How often do you write?
Well, to be really honest, I go through phases where I'm producing a great deal. Like Life on Mars, most of it, the bulk of it, was written in 2009. But then there are silences where I'm hopefully feeding myself, or writing prose. So it kind of comes and goes, and I'm finally at a place in my career where I feel comfortable letting that happen, knowing that just a silence is usually followed by something else that's not quite as lazy feeling. So.
I appreciate what you said about your experience feeling slightly embarrassed reading in front of the scientists. That resonates with me because I think with me, because I feel like if you're a writer taking risks, if you're writing about people and you're writing about a community of people that you're not a part of, and then you find yourself reading in front of that group of people and your imaginative speculations don't sound as great anymore. You wonder if they're serving other people in the same way they served you. And even though you said you were sort of alleviated in that experience by the responses of the scientists, I'm wondering if had an impact on the way you were writing about that subject matter, or if you took it into account.
Oh God, this is like the audience concern, that we always think about as writers. How should we think about the audience? And to be really honest with you, I try and just not think about the audience at all until the poem is safely finished, because otherwise that anxiety would prevent me from even saying most of the things that I say. I really believe that as a writer, what you're doing when you're creating a poem is really similar to what happens with a reader. Like, you're really in what feels like a private conversation. You're generating images and ideas and music, but you're also listening to what you've written and trying to look at it and see what it can show you that you didn't know was there. And I think that when a poem is realized, it puts the reader in a very similar position. So the reader it feels almost like he or she is having intimate contact with the world of the poem. So I tell myself this: if I can really invest in the creation of the poem and really lose myself to the seeming realness of whatever I'm working with, the reader might get some of that as well. And then the poem gets finished, and it goes through different stages of revision, and maybe the final stage or two is saying, okay, I do want this to be a public document, and so I need to think about clarity, and maybe I use a lot of notes in my books that provide the reader with access to some of the source material behind poems. So that kind of thing, which can also help ensure that we are truly on the same page, and that there are fewer opportunities for misreading. But of course, the poem is also an interesting thing because I'm filling it with, my emotional material. But that space in the poem is also available to the reader. So inevitably, the reader's going to bring something to the poem that I didn't realize was there. I don't know if that directly answers your question, but it's better for me not to worry about that until I know that the poem isn't going to disappear.
I was wondering in what ways you view poetry as a science. I know lots of writers speak about how a poem isn't necessarily to arrive at answers, but kind of to arrive at questions, and it kind of mirrors research in a way. I was wondering if you could speak to that.
I love that idea. And I do believe that a poem is really just a way of complicating what we think we know. There's so much in life that tries to simplify things and tell us it's this. You have this choice or this choice. And, it just comes down to this black and white thing. When what we truly crave, I think, as humans is nuance and unsuspected layers. And so I think a poem is really good at doing that. I think that I feel like that's what you're learning when you are, in liberal arts education or sciences probably too. You're learning to move past the obvious or apparent and move towards something that, might be surprising and even startling. So there are myriad ways of doing that in a poem, but I think at heart, maybe that is the science of poetry. It's about finding spaces where we hadn't expected them to be and trying to examine what characterizes them. One last question.
What's the experience like of receiving a Pulitzer?
It was popping corks on champagne bottles. It was a great surprise, a huge honor. I feel like any prize is really like somebody saying, "Keep at it, kid. Just keep on trying," and that felt great. And then, of course, there's also the very humbling fact of, all my life as a young writer wanting to feel like I was having a conversation with those voices of writers whose work I love and have been so helped by. And then you see the list of people who have won this prize, and it kind of makes you feel, oh, maybe I am, part of that conversation in a way. So that's, there's nothing like that. Well, thank you so much for your questions.